Yeah.
I mean, I find that this whole security discussion, I find it hard to have a strong view on it anyway, because, on the one hand, I feel myself, as someone who lives in a Western democracy and I uphold those values, then I can sort of see, if we did have some kind of big conflict in the future, we're probably going to be on the opposite side to China, and therefore having a kind of having.
They're the new opposing superpower to the US
exactly.
and the West. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. We're a little bit thin on the ground this week because everyone else is either on holiday or doing more important things than hanging out with us. But thankfully, Iain doesn't have more important things to do.
I have no life.
So we're going to have a rare dialogue between me and Iain of Light Reading. And also, as this is probably the last one we're going to do of the year, I'm certainly off on holiday next week, as are you.
Yep.
I thought rather than necessarily focus on breaking news, we'd have a bit of a sort of retrospective of the year, the big stories of the year.
Yeah.
So,
and we can get Pierre involved.
Yeah, we can get Pierre involved as well.
He can be the third man.
Although he's never got the camera on him, which is a bit of a shame, as he's much better looking than either of us. But there you go. We're certainly younger anyway. You wait till you're my age.
Yeah.
So what we're going to talk about for PS Captions, we are going to talk chiefly about 5G and about politics as it affects the telecoms industry. And when I'm tempted to stray from where it affects the telecoms industry, I expect Pierre to tell me off, because that's what he does. And just a reminder that if you're watching it on the site or on Facebook or on YouTube, you can listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud and countless other podcasting platforms. Cool. Have I done all the housekeeping all right, Pierre?
Yeah, that's it.
I thought we could have another topic as well.
Oh, okay.
Just to make it a bit more interesting. As it's the last one for Christmas, I thought we could do a little mini beer tasting.
Hello.
Yes.
What have we got here?
So I got a few beers on the way in. There's only 3, but I thought we could sort of share them. And I got a bottle opener as well.
I was going to say, yeah.
Well, I've got one on my keyring because I'm that much of a...
I have one too.
They're all IPAs, but they're...
That's the good stuff.
Quite few ones.
I thought you were just going to break out the ones that Pierre nicked for you out of the BA lounge on the way to Vienna.
I never did that.
I'm making that up. That didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm making this up.
Yeah. Do you think that the BA lounge people are listening to this podcast, Pierre?
I don't know if we need glasses or whether we can just...
No, we can just swig. I don't mind your jams. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Nice one, mate. A bit of spillage there. It's all right.
That's okay.
Okay, so let's not bore our audience with sounds of beers being opened. So I'll kick it off. So the big, obvious telecoms news story of the year, thank you very much, is Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah.
Oh, I'll have this one.
You have this.
You got
we can sort of pass them around, I suppose.
Pass them around.
So I'm on a Hyde and Wild, which I've never heard of before. American style IPA, 5.6%.
5.6. Go on, son. And I've got a Sainsbury's Taste the Difference American style IPA.
That's quite nice.
Which is made by Marston's. Okay, cool.
I'm on a Sierra Nevada.
Okay, we all know about that.
So Sierra Nevada is the only one I've had before, but...
Oh wait, I wanted to do a little shout out to the countries listening to us, actually. Little audience. So shout out to America, who's our biggest audience.
Is it?
Then the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Canada, Germany, Australia, Sweden and India to be like the top 8.
Okay.
That's nice. Wait, it's funny if you go down.
Imagine people listening to us in Australia.
I want to say hello to the one guy at Cape Verde.
Excellent.
The one guy regular? In Burundi. And then the 2 people in Madagascar. And then...
You should ask them to send some vanilla over.
The 2 guys in Latvia as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
That's pretty good.
Thank you, all of you. I do get people every now and then, like at the event we were at in Vienna, some guy came up and said that he listens to us while he's walking the dog.
That's right, I remember. Can't remember where he was from, but we can't say anyway, can we?
Yeah, exactly.
He wasn't there.
Yeah. So anyway, the obvious story of the year was 5G.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through a whole exhaustive chronology of it all, but it got started off. We'd obviously been writing sceptical stories on both our sites because everyone had been going on about it and hyping it up. And we know every new generation gets hyped up, and the marketing departments of vendors and operators just work themselves into a lather because it's a once in a decade chance for them to actually say they've got something new.
Yeah.
And perhaps unsurprisingly, it was a US marketing department that really jumped the gun, specifically AT&T, with this thing, LT evolution. 5G evolution.
Yeah.
Which was just basically LTE advanced. So, I mean, I can't.
Didn't they call it 5G evolution at one point? They used that.
Yeah, 5G evolution.
5G
yeah.
evolution. Yeah.
But it was basically LTE advanced.
It was basically 4G evolution, but they called it 5G.
Well, yes, technically. Yeah, evolving towards 5G, but that wasn't implied in the name.
Is low band 5G technically just the same as LTE advanced in terms of speeds?
Yeah, it's rubbish. Well, in terms of what you get.
I mean,
technically, it's
I wish I had it.
But.
So I wrote a piece, I don't know if I wrote it in Vienna, but yeah, being deliberately provocative, basically saying that at lower frequencies, 5G is a bit of a waste of time. And we had this discussion on the pod a little while back, and I've got to be honest, I still don't consider myself 100% expert on the physics of it all.
Right.
But my understanding is the main reason, and 5G does have some new technologies, new air interface, this new radio, all that sort of thing. But my understanding, and you correct me if you disagree, Ian, is that basically the reason you're going to get more speed out of 5G is that you can use these frequencies that are further up that no one could be bothered with up until now, or didn't have the technology to make full use of. So suddenly then you've got a whole chunk of, let's say, 100 megahertz of spectrum, which is literally, well, not literally, but certainly for the purpose of the metaphor, a fatter pipe. So you're just pumping, if you think of it as a liquid through a pipe, you just got fatter pipes so you can get more liquid through. And it's as simple as that. And that fatness of pipe isn't available at lower frequencies. It's as simple as that. So, I mean, that's my understanding of the main...
Yeah, I think the air interface is a bit better.
Yeah.
And I remember talking to Vodafone about this a few months ago, and they were saying it does bring... The actual air interface itself does reduce latency between the device and the base station. You get a latency reduction compared with 4G. So there are some performance improvements that come from the technology. But the fact that people have been doing speed tests in the US on these low frequency networks that are 5G, and there's not really any difference with 4G, just kind of proves your point that it is very heavily related to how much spectrum you've got.
Isn't it because the high frequency? Infrastructure wise, it's a much bigger effort than the low band stuff.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons it's more available is because
But yeah,
it doesn't go a long way, and it runs into obstacles, and you need loads and loads of base stations to cover an area. So it's not economical to use the high frequency stuff, and it's all been really overhyped in the US, I think, because you can only really do sort of hotspot coverage and building small area coverage with it. So you can't build a macro network using those frequencies, and that's why there's all this stuff about the spottiness of Verizon's network, for instance, which T-Mobile has been going on about all year, I think.
Yeah.
But the alternative is to use really low frequency stuff when you don't get the speed benefits.
Which is exactly what T-Mobile has done.
What you really want is actually what, Europe, the laggard in 5G. Well, yeah, but they one thing they do have that they don't have in the US is this mid-band spectrum around about sort of 3.5 gigahertz, where you get sort of best of both worlds. You get.
Do you? You still got pretty crappy range, haven't you? On
a lot of the operators say that if you combine 3.5 with massive MIMO, so you use the capabilities you're getting with massive MIMO and use 3.5, you can do it on your existing grid.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no extra small cells needed.
No, you might put small cells in urban areas anyway, because
but that's more a capacity thing.
But on the sort of macro planning basis, they say they can do it with the. 3 says that. Vodafone in the UK hasn't. I don't think they've directly said, but they seem to be working on that basis.
I suppose it stands to reason. There's probably a sort of chart or graph that would show it. But if you can use up to 2.1 gig.
Well, it's 2.1. It's not a massive difference. It's not like going
3.5.
The high frequency stuff you're talking about is 26 gigahertz or whatever, 30 gigahertz,
60 and stuff.
So that's a world apart from this.
Yeah.
Anything between 2 and 4, I think.
Let me put it this way: if we can get the low 5G, basically giving us, the consumers, what 4G should have been, like the best 4G ever, and then everywhere, I'll be very happy with that.
Yeah, it's good.
That'd be a good start for me.
That's a good if.
I'd be happy with that for many years.
Well, and
that speed is great.
That's part of the point. So I wrote this piece sort of being, I'll be honest, deliberately provocative about... T-Mobile US has got a bunch of 600 megahertz spectrum, which I hadn't found much use for. And obviously that's lower. Our lowest is about 800 or 900 in the UK. Isn't it?
Well, there was a auction for 4G. I think that's being used for 4G actually.
So that's obviously low. I'm sure it's not linear, but in principle, the lower you get, the better the propagation characteristics and range. So that's going to have really good range.
Yeah.
But as you say, if it's got really good range, but all you've basically got is 4G, then that was why I wrote my sceptical piece going, what's the point?
Yeah.
But, you know, Pierre, your point's well made. If what it delivers is really good, you know, let's say 50 megabits per second connectivity or something everywhere, then that'll do.
I mean, do you know how many times I'm on a voice over LTE phone call and I walk for 10 minutes?
Yeah.
How far is that? You know, in any neighborhood in central London, and it drops because I'm in a nut spot. That's insane.
Yeah, in London.
In London.
I think you could do what they're doing with 4G. To be honest, though, yeah. I mean, you can soup up 4G now with all the carrier aggregation stuff, and you know, it's not massive MIMO, but you can still use more sophisticated MIMO systems and have more antennas, you know, and there's all sorts of ways of basically pumping up the capability of the 4G network to get super fast speeds that are more than good enough for most applications. So I don't think that. It's just a really underwhelming technology, I think, from a consumer perspective. I mean, if you stand next to your neighbour and he goes, you know, I wrote an article about this week, but when 3G came along, although 3G turned out to be a massive disappointment because the technology just wasn't very good and the handsets weren't there and all sorts of other reasons, it didn't really succeed.
And people hadn't really made the stuff to use
but the actual message was really quite exciting at the time. And if you go back to the mid-1990s when mobile phones were just for voice and text, the idea of being able to have a device that gives you the internet, I mean, the internet was only in its infancy then on fixed broadband networks. So it's quite... I remember thinking to myself back then, this sounds really exciting stuff. And then it didn't really work out. And 4G sort of came along and fixed those problems very quietly, but did it in a successful way. 5G, people, you know, if anybody says to you, what's 5G? Tell me what 5G is. Someone outside the telecom network. And you go, it's faster, isn't it? It doesn't sound, you know, it's not like, it's a flying car.
It feels like there's a generation delay. Like when 6G comes along, we'll get what 5G
well, I
actually
think
means.
Maybe the excitement in 5G is this core stuff, you know, but I don't think it's the sort of thing that's necessarily going to excite consumers. I mean, who knows? Maybe some of the low latency stuff that's supposed to be easier to support with these core networks will give rise to things like virtual reality gaming that excites millennials and Generation Z types. And so maybe that's where the excitement is.
But it's mainly, I completely agree, it's much more a B2B proposition. So in recent weeks I've written about trials going on with like automated shipping and stuff, which is basically a sort of more a sort of big IoT type of thing because there's sensors everywhere, make sure a ship doesn't go into the side of the pier or whatever. And it's not that much, it's not that far removed from, it's not that science fiction, is it? I mean, they already use connectivity in factories to do stuff to improve, you know, operations. So it's not a massive leap. It's just being able to do it on a bigger scale, I think. And the things that the Ericssons and the Huaweis of this world try and excite us with, like self-driving cars and remote surgery. I mean, let's be honest, those things aren't going to be around before 6G comes along. Any robot comes near me with a scalpel and we've got problems.
Well, I don't think that's ever going to work because no one's going to want to go under the knife.
If I get issues walking with voice over LTE, imagine what a car, you know, how fast it travels.
Exactly. So then we get to other more boring but ultimately very useful features, which is the sort of robustness. You know, when everyone was sort of banging on about why you should care about 5G, there's sort of triangle of core features. There's enhanced mobile broadband, which is basically more 4G. There was the massive IoT thing. And then the third one, which I certainly thought was the most novel, was this ultra low latency, but also ultra reliable. They tend to get grouped together, don't they? Yeah. And so there's a robustness and an instantaneousness to the technology, which has been sort of lacking previously. And then you can see, like with this shipping thing, obviously there's no point in having all these IoT sensors all over the ship if there's a delay of a second, because it might have already sort of drifted into the pier by that stage. You know, they talk about it for navigating really narrow bits, like going through Panama Canal.
Yeah, or using it to control drones or something.
So you mean steering more like?
Yeah, steering and just sensors. Just, you know, the thing about IoT, certainly when it comes to transport and logistics and vehicles and that sort of thing, is just a sort of ubiquitous electronic awareness of everything around you. But obviously that requires, as you say, it can't be cutting out.
No.
You can't have an autonomous vehicle and then it hits a knot spot and then just
even if it's just one tiny knot spot in the whole city, then there'll be an accident zone.
Yeah.
You know, people talk about like 5 nines and all this incredibly low degree of failure. So you have to have that, and then you have to have the very low latency because there can't be any delay. So that's where it's interesting. But as you say, that's not really a consumer proposition, is it? Until someone comes up with some cool VR app where you can walk around. Maybe you could have a VR, because like with VR, always struck me that you're never going to use VR unless you're in like a room like this,
Yeah, you
like a
don't
padded cell, basically.
Yeah.
Because you've got no ability to discern what's going on in the outside world. You're completely immersed by definition. But imagine if you had VR together with some kind of bodysuit with tons of sensors that in some way prevented you from, walking in front of traffic or whatever.
Yeah.
Then you could have people just wandering around with these headsets on. It's very dystopian, but you can sort of imagine that.
Sounds expensive.
But
It does sound expensive.
I think the main thing is it's a telecom industry story more than a.
Yeah.
It's the reason that companies are investing in it and they want it is because they need extra spectrum. They need to, because the networks are getting busy. You look at data usage and what the forecasts are. And if you've got more IoT connections coming online as well, it's all just too much for them to be able to support with the kind of technologies they've got at the moment. So they need additional spectrum, they need more efficient technologies, and that's where 5G comes in. And that's not something you can really go out and excite people about, that, it's going to help companies, it's going to help your telecom operator run its business in an efficient way for the next few years without running into cost problems.
Rock and roll.
That may be great for you from your CTO's perspective, but try and excite a consumer or an investor with something like that, and they're not going to. Maybe some investors will buy into it, I guess. But
when I sent
doesn't sell 5G phones. Yeah.
When I wrote my sort of 5G over low frequency is a waste of time bit, I saw a little bit of chuntering on both in the comments and on the internet from people who are in the industry.
Yeah.
There was the implication which I'm used to and which has a fair bit of validity that I didn't know what I was talking about. But you could tell it was also Scott, this isn't very helpful. We're trying to big this up and you're writing this downer stuff.
Yeah.
But obviously it's not our job to big it up. It's our job to call it like we see it. Well, they've bigged it up
in a way that's slightly ridiculous, though, I think, this year. You look back at some of the stories and the press releases and... it's sort of, there's a massive disconnect from reality. Nobody else is running around getting excited about 5G.
Yeah.
You go on the streets and people don't. We went to a conference that wasn't under Chatham House rules. No, it wasn't. I think it was Jamie actually was at this private networks one where a guy from Shell stood up and went, not really interested in it. I can do it all with 4G. I mean, he says it might have some relevance for some things in the future, but. I'm doing it with 4G at the moment.
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm not going to be a driving force behind 5G. He said.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest companies in the world. Yeah, saying that.
And it's so important. I've noticed this, having been a business journalist for a while. You get this sort of groupthink. You get this sort of collective Kool-Aid being drunk, and you think it's a bit like which we'll probably get onto in a bit. It's a bit like with politics. If you just keep over-promising or you keep spinning a narrative, which people can't relate to on the ground, they're just going to call bullshit.
Yeah.
So you've got to have some message discipline. You've got to think, well, hold on a sec. Obviously we've got commercial objectives. Obviously we want to big this stuff up, but let's not overreach and then end up disappointing people and then be worse off than if we just hadn't said anything at all.
Yeah.
So that's a tricky one. Like I said, AT&T overdid it. They've only just launched their actual 5G now.
I saw that today. There was
like 11 months after they launched 5G
evolution. So they've gone backwards, basically. They had something that was almost 6G, and now they're just at the 5G stage.
Yeah, exactly. And even then, they've segmented it. They've got 5G and they've got 5G plus.
Yeah. Well, there was quite a bit of piss-taking about this, I seem to remember, in Vienna at the Chatham House Rules event, so we can't say who was saying what, but I remember there was a lot of discussion about how ridiculous it was.
Oh, it's probably been the singular source of sort of derision in the industry for the whole year. So well done on that one, AT&T. Yeah. They were also, like when we did our awards, it's also one of our most read stories of the year, that one.
I think it shows the desperation as well, though, doesn't it? That they've positioning 5G as something very exciting. They're obviously looking for, both on the equipment side and on the sort of service provider side, they're looking for growth opportunities. It's a market that's been pretty flat for years, and anything that comes along they seize onto because they need revenue growth through.
It's just a marketing story.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody's going to see. I mean, 5G will be heavily used a few years from now. It will give rise to new applications. Some people will do well out of it. The trouble is, I don't think the telecom industry is going to do very well out of it.
No. So who is?
Think application providers, maybe. It will lead to better productivity in a factory environment. I can certainly buy into that argument. I think it's good for. I buy into the argument. It's good for the economy generally.
But when you say like better productivity in an industrial environment, they've still got to get. They still need that communication service. Someone's got to provide that communication service, haven't they?
Someone has, yeah. But I don't.
So isn't that an opportunity?
Well, it's the telecom operators will make some money from providing connectivity to those businesses.
But it'll be quite commoditised.
But I think it's going to be quite commoditised. I don't think it's going to be the hype that we're hearing at the moment doesn't match what the reality is going to be at all, I don't think. And the companies that are probably going to do really well in that sort of, selling a solution, I guess, to BMW or whoever it might be, are probably IT companies, or systems integrator type companies, not the telcos themselves.
Or other people they partner with, like we had, while we were in Vienna, we had that news with AWS. Getting involved with various people. But so
the consumer side, there's no upside at all on the consumer side.
No,
because all they're doing is replacing 4G subscriptions with 5G subscriptions. The pricing is basically at 4G levels already in the UK. In competitive markets, and it will go down in.
There's very little indication that anywhere in any Western market that the market supports a premium.
Yeah, I mean, people got a bit excited about South Korea, I've noticed, because it's picked up a lot of customers in the last few months. I think it's got 2 million or something users.
Yeah, and they
already.
were first.
It sounds like a lot more than anybody else, because if you ask Vodafone UK at the moment, they won't tell you. They actually refuse to give the numbers out.
Okay.
Which sounds like it isn't
implies,
very many.
Yeah, exactly. If they were huge, they would, wouldn't they?
Because obviously if they're 2 million, they'd have said it. So they've got a lot in South Korea, but if you look at the impact on, and they are pricing it a little bit higher than 4G, but it's still not. It's not like their revenues are up 10% because of it.
No,
it's a tiny thine and
they're trying to take the lead on this sort of 5G killer app type of stuff. I don't think it's coincidence that at our awards, SK Telecom was by far the biggest winner.
Yeah.
Because they're just trying stuff out.
They're pretty innovative.
Yeah, they're trying stuff out. And I don't know what it is. I don't know whether they get some state support or because...
I think they do.
Yeah, well, South Korea certainly did way back with its broadband network, because let's not forget, South Korea has been a bit of a project since the Korean War. But it could also be that there are some real efficiencies by the fact that half the country lives in Seoul.
Yeah.
So they can deal with most people without having to get into all this rural mucking about. But anyway, they seem to be the ones who are rolling the dice the most.
I don't think the equipment providers are going to do great out of it either. And you certainly would think there's an opportunity for them to make some money from this, because they have to sell new network gear and new network services to telecom operators that are rolling it out. So the expectation will be, well, if the service providers might not, because they're just replacing 4G subscriptions with 5G ones, but it's a different case when you're actually bringing in new gear. But I'm not convinced they're going to do great. I mean, if you look at forecasts by analyst firms that are all over this stuff, like Del Oro, it's only for I don't know what their 5G for. It's a couple of percent they're looking at over the next few years, I think. Might be a bit more than that. But it's not like the market's... It's not like it's going to lead to some kind of boom. And I think the trouble is that because it's going to get rolled out so slowly, it's going to be 7 to 10 years probably before a lot of countries have 100% coverage.
Well, not 100%, but...
Yeah, and it won't even be that, but, up at a high level.
90s, yeah.
A lot of equipment that's already been deployed can be upgraded using software, I think. There's more competition now coming into the market. There's sort of commoditization happening there. So I just think the upside for the equipment industry isn't that clear either.
Yeah, well, so timescales-wise, there was a story that you and I were chatting about before we did the pod about Telenor in Norway going all in on Ericsson for its 5G RAN.
Yeah.
And we might get to some of the other stuff, like it's replacing Huawei, and that's more in the sort of... that more overlaps with the sort of politics narrative. But... in their press release, they went, it's going to take about 4 or 5 years to do that. In the meanwhile, Huawei still going to be involved.
Yeah.
So if that is typical, now they're not under pressure because, the Norwegian government, again, this is the more political stuff, but whatever. The Norwegian government went, look, we're all right, we're not going to go with this banning Huawei thing. So they're not, as far as we know, under pressure to get rid of Huawei. They've just decided, they've made a decision for whatever reason that they're going to go with a new vendor, but they're going to take 5 years doing it.
Yeah.
So if that's an indication of how long it takes for an inception to roll out a 5G network, then that backs up what you were saying.
Yeah, and also, and this is quite well known because Ericsson's been public about it, but one of the reasons they're winning these deals is that companies are prepared to swap out, Huawei and bring in Ericsson, and it's not just... Telenor that's doing that. Telia in Norway is doing the same thing. Is because Ericsson's being super aggressive on price. I mean, they've said themselves they're prepared to take less profitable contracts to win market share.
Which was a big change. I remember when Boy Ekholm came in, he was all about we've got to restore profitability.
Well, they think they can do it without denting these targets that they've got.
Right.
This 10% operating margin, I think, next year, and then one of 12 to 14%.
Because a big part of that was more them just getting out of random, more peripheral,
but they
weird stuff, like managed services.
They're doing things like saying, they're doing the sort of thing that Huawei did years ago, back in the 4G era, when Huawei came along and went, we'll build a complete new radio access network for you that supports everything from 2G to 4G, and we'll cover the costs of replacing equipment vendors that you've used up to now. That's basically what Ericsson's starting to do now. Maybe
so
not
of course
quite
everyone was like,
extent. And that's probably why they've been swayed, because from what we hear, we go to a lot of industry events, and people still talk about Huawei being a kind of tech leader, don't they? They still talk about it as being, I know Ericsson's kind of maybe reclaimed some of that reputation that it had lost a bit, I think, to Huawei in the past. They seem to have done a good job of coming up with extremely competitive 5G products. But
a year or two ago, another big differentiator Huawei used to get in its favour was the sort of post-sale support.
Yeah.
The amount of people that it would devote to making sure...
you pick up the phone and they just turn up en masse
to making sure that everything worked. So there's that. But yes, there's no doubt that they're... sure. There's no doubt that that they're way beyond their previous reputation of being a bit of a sort of pile them high, sell them cheap, and in terms of R&D and in terms of the actual quality of the products, they're highly competitive.
Quite similar, those.
Are they?
Those
I haven't tried the one with a bear on it.
So I'm now on the American-style IPA, which is a Sainsbury's own.
Ooh.
Yep. Yeah, it's cool. I can tell that your one's a little bit stronger.
Sainsbury's Taste the Difference, 5%. You're probably still drinking the best one.
Yeah, I'm not sharing.
No, it's fine. You've got your little headphones on. Okay, so there's that 5G-ness. I'm just thinking we've been meandering a fair bit, which is good. This dialogues are a bit different, aren't they, to having three people? You can just go off on one.
How long have we been going for?
Oh, about half an hour. Is that right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, about that.
Oh, okay.
So we'll switch topics soon.
Politics.
Just making sure that there's nothing else really fundamental about 5G that we haven't mentioned. No, I mean, I guess, we should just note that all the operators, certainly in developed markets, have launched 5G this year.
Yeah.
There was the Ericsson. Ericsson does their, is it quarterly, their sort of mobile state of the industry type of thing. And
I'm not a fan of that.
Well, it's quite top line, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just... Yeah, it's very top line, and it doesn't really sort of relate any of it to, how well people are going to do out of any of this.
Right, commercial
stuff. Sales
stuff.
Opportunity.
Yeah. But then again, it's an easy thing to write up if there's not much going on.
It is.
And when I wrote up this one, I always try and look for an angle other than the one that they present in their press release.
Yeah.
And what I saw is that one of their charts that was just showing the growth of 5G.
Yeah, there's a lot of hockey stick curves in that.
There's all that sort of thing. Well, this is one of those block ones where you've got like 5G, 4G, 3G, and they occupy little segments.
Yeah.
And I just noticed that the real inflection point, i.e. the point at which 5G starts to really grow from the tiny little sliver that we got now, wasn't until 2021.
Right.
So what I took from that is next year we shouldn't get our hopes too high about uptake. I think this was like subscribers.
Yeah.
So this is consistent with what you and I have just been saying earlier on, that there's not a really compelling consumer proposition right now. And I think one thing that will happen next year is that it won't explode as a consumer thing.
One thing that will help it a lot is when Apple comes out with a 5G phone, clearly, because there's a huge
September.
Community that's just going to stick with Apple, and it's not going to switch to Android handsets no matter what. So
so all those phones will have 5G chips in them.
Yeah.
To what extent people will take that opportunity?
Well, I think people will upgrade anyway, because they're not just going to do a phone that is based on 5G. They'll put some other features in it, and it'll be a better camera, and it'll be all that stuff. So
most people probably get them on postpaid contracts.
I don't think this is the thing I'm not convinced about, is people these days actually going out and saying, right, I need to get a 4G subscription. I don't think I went and got a 4G subscription specifically. I just got a phone that happened to be a 4G, and everybody's using the 4G internet by then, because the 3G is I think that's how a lot of tech works, actually. If you're not an early adopter, Yeah.
You just go, oh well, it's just as
end up
easy.
using
It's just as easy to have
Most
that as
people
the
don't
old
even
one.
know.
It's like my parents have got smartphones now because after years and years of using old-style devices, they've eventually kind of got persuaded by their provider to upgrade. So they've got devices that have got 4G connections, and my dad started reading the news sometimes on his phone on a 4G link when he's out on the bus or whatever. But it's not like they've gone specifically looking for 4G, and that's why there will be billions of users in a few years' time. But the providers aren't going to make any money out of it, I'm afraid.
Okay, cool. All right. Well,
Any extra money.
We'll move it on then to politics. So there's basically two sub-strands.
Hold on, Ian, let me turn down his mic. All the way down.
So it should be noted, we're recording this the day after the UK general election, which everyone who's listening will probably know. But if you're one of our listeners in Burundi or whatever, we'll let you know that the Conservative Party won quite a handsome majority. Now, seeing as I brought that up, I might as well mention that angle first. The reason that's relevant to the telecoms industry, and my card's on the table, I voted Conservative and I wanted them to win for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I voted Brexit and they were the only people who were going to see that through. And secondly, which is relevant to the telecoms industry, is the Labour Party manifesto, and this current Labour Party is about as close to full-on socialism as we've had in this country since maybe the 70s.
Yeah.
And one of the manifestations of their socialist manifesto that they announced not that long ago was that they were going to nationalise broadband, which basically meant just appropriating Openreach, Virgin, City Fibre, whoever else, and just going, no, we're having that on behalf of the people.
Plus some of the retail parts of BT.
Right, yeah, and other bits and bobs.
I think that's something that the bits of the investment community have got wrong, actually. They seem to think that it was just a plan to nationalise, to do what they did in Australia. The fibre itself. But actually BT Retail's included it. And the only things that they weren't nationalising that were BT were EE, Global Services, I think, the IT arm, and a couple of sub-brands like
so
Plusnet.
their plan was to be the provider, not just the infrastructure owner, but the actual provider. And, of course, the only provider. And, it's a cliche, but state monopolies are still monopolies. And they tend to be, in many ways, more inefficient than private monopolies. Private monopolies are profiteering, and they'll abuse their position to maximise return to stakeholders like shareholders. State monopolies just tend to be inefficient because you've got no choice.
And this was a state monopoly that wouldn't charge anybody, remember, as well.
It wouldn't charge anybody.
No, you get the money from taxing Apple and Google heavily.
That's right, that was their cunning plan. Their cunning plan was to heavily tax the companies that are the most efficient at dodging exactly that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The biggest beneficiary would probably have been Ireland. Yeah. They would have just gone and hid over there. Just took all their stuff over there and gone, up yours.
And they were going to run it, this organisation. I mean, the sums were bonkers as well. Yeah. They were going to run this 55,000 person. I worked out it was probably going to have at least 55,000 people because they promised they weren't going to cut any jobs. And people were going to get paid the same or better. And they were going to run it on 230 million a year. That was their forecast of how much it would cost to run.
And you did some sums. So what does that mean? You get paid?
Well, it's like peanuts.
You get paid
I can't remember the figures, but it's like
year.
It's ridiculous. So
I know it's just absurd. For the sake of not getting told off by Pierre, I'm not going to go off to a massive one about quite how poor the maths were.
I mean, that's not why they lost the election, obviously, but it was a lot of stuff like that.
I think it must have been a factor. I mean, it's futile to second guess the electorate, and everyone likes to write narratives after the event. And I could write all these lofty narratives because my team won. But yes, I mean, obviously it was a bit of a second referendum on Brexit, given that that Labour are equivocating about Brexit and Tories are going, we're definitely going to do it. So for people like me, that made it a no-brainer, especially once the Brexit party went, okay, all right, we're going to mainly just give in.
Well, they did sort of give in, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't win anything, I don't think.
No, they didn't win a single seat. So there was that. There was other bits and bobs which I won't go into to do with Corbyn as an individual and some more unsavoury reputations that his part of the Labour Party's got. But I do think the extreme leftism, the extreme statism, I think
that's what did it for them.
Yeah, and so getting back on track. Look, I haven't even been bollocked yet. Getting back on track because he's on his phone.
Yeah, bring it back to Telecom.
I could have been doing a massive political rant.
He's lost interest now because he's had half a beer.
Yeah,
so his mind's wandered.
He's chilled out. That's what it is. Yes. So that appropriating the whole broadband scenario is a manifestation of this broader sort of statism thing. And yeah, it was just baffling. I mean, the thing that slightly baffles me, so they took quite a bad beating, but they still got about a third of the country voting for him.
Yeah.
And, you know, the weird thing is how people will vote, even though they know, I mean, there won't be a single sensible person who thinks that state appropriation of private property is a good thing. Obviously, it drives investment away. What private money would stay in the UK if they thought it could just get nicked by the government any time? It goes without saying. But it's amazing how many people would just vote for him anyway.
Well, I think there's lots of weird things going on in this election. This is totally off topic now.
Yeah.
I think there were lots of weird things going on. I think the whole Brexit obviously complicated things a lot because, you know, the Tories are obviously going to present this as a big endorsement of Brexit, but I still think we'd probably split somewhere down the middle if we went out and did a referendum. So, and I think that made it quite difficult for a lot of people knowing where to vote because they looked at Labour, who was sort of didn't really have a very firm position on it, and it wasn't easy to kind of vote for them because of their sort of bonkers hard left plans. And then the Lib Dems are just a bit sort of unconvincing, I think, to people, and everybody's wary of voting for them because they sort of think it's a wasted vote. So even though they proposed, they would have appealed to Remainers, obviously, a lot of Remainers, by saying we're going to actually just scrap plans to. That was their big gambit. Big thing, but it didn't pay off. It didn't pay off. But it very rarely anything that Lib Dems does never really pays off. No, people just go, we're not going to vote for you because we just see it as a wasted vote. That seems to be the general attitude. So
So, I mean, the telecoms industry must be breathing a sigh of relief today.
Yeah, so I did a little mini sort of snippet, kind of news in brief thing on it because I just quickly looked at BT's share price this morning, which was up 10%.
Right.
So, and I think it was still up 8% before we came in.
And it would just be on the back of the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just the weird thing was when Labour was coming out with all these bonkers plans about nationalising most of BT, their share price didn't dip. Then it was almost like investors had just said, is they never going to get in? And yet the certainty that it's now provided has led to some kind of rebound, and their share price is still pretty low.
It could be. You didn't look at the whole FTSE 100, did you?
Well, I suspect the FTSE's up a lot.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, business generally has recovered, so it's not just related to. But they were specifically called out by a number of banks, like doing equity analysis and sort of picking stocks that are likely to have done well.
Okay.
And BT was
so maybe
one
it's
of
a
them
double whammy because I think an interesting thing, and this is relevant to business, about Brexit, how it's played out, is uncertainty.
Yeah.
So most big business doesn't like Brexit. Big business likes being part of the European Union because being part of this super state provides sort of stability, visibility. It means that you get more bang for your buck in terms of lobbying, all that sort of thing. You basically know where you stand if you're a big FTSE 100 company.
Yeah.
So most of them were hostile to it.
Yeah.
But I think they're even more hostile to just complete political uncertainty.
Yeah.
They almost like, look, we don't like Brexit, but we'd still rather you got on with it than kept dicking about for another 3 years.
Yeah. Well,
seems to be the view.
The other factors specifically relating to BT as well are that there's another review coming out which had been held up by the election. It's supposed to be this month, but it's now looking like early next year. Now under Labour, that review would have been probably just cancelled because
review
of the communications market and doing
in
things
general.
like, well, it's more to do with the Conservatives got a very ambitious plan to get fibre built basically everywhere by 2025.
Which is clearly bollocks.
Yeah, it's not going to happen. But at
least it's not as mad as just owning the whole industry.
There's a big gap there that needs to be served because we're only at about 8%, I think, in terms of full fibre. So they can certainly make a lot of progress by 2025. And one of the things that needs to happen is giving BT the certainty to go ahead and sort of deploy fibre more widely than it has so far. And that means giving it some kind of, providing regulatory certainty means sort of telling it things that it wants to hear about pricing and about the sort of levels of access it has to provide to other companies. And that's part of this review that's supposed to happen. So I think the fact that the election is now kind of concluded and the Conservatives are in, they're pretty confident they're going to get a good decision in January that allows them to move ahead with some of these plans. But I still think this is quite a sort of, I mean, this up 8%, they're still very far down on where they were a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, before a whole sort of wave of problems that they had.
Yeah.
And I still think there's huge challenges for them in the market. I mean, it's not anywhere near as bad as having Labour coming in, obviously, but they've got huge issues ahead of them, BT, I think. It's not...
Yeah.
And Brexit's going to make things more awkward for them with their fibre rollout plans as well, because most of the people who do that job are from the EU. So, you're not going to kick people.
Do what job? The engineers?
Do the engineering job,
right.
yeah. And they've already flagged concern about this. One of their big concerns about a disorderly Brexit was that you sort of lose access to EU talent pools, and that you scare people off, because people tend to go home when they hear Boris Johnson walking around saying things like EU citizens have been treating this country like their own for too long. It tends to sort of scare people off. So
I've got a feeling he's going to tone down that rhetoric.
Well, I think he's going to have to.
I think part of that rhetoric was, again, it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to bring it back to something that's relevant to business. Part of that rhetoric was having to sort of match the Brexit Party, and the more instinctively, I won't use the word xenophobic, I think that's massively overused, but the more instinctively parochial perspectives. So maybe he had to sort of go, well, that's quite enough of that. And obviously, if you want to leave, then you want to leave, and there's got to be a reason. If you're so keen on having total open access to Europe, then you wouldn't want to leave. That's a big part of why people like me voted to leave.
Yeah.
But then there's, he did his little sort of Boris Johnson, a jolly good show sort of speech this morning. And one of the things he mentioned was this Australian points system. So the thinking behind that, I don't know how it works in practice. I'd need to chat to an Aussie and see what they think. But the thinking behind that is that you still got plenty of skilled labour coming in, but you've got some control over the amount of just pure economic migrants who are likely to be a sort of drain on the state. Anyway, I'm not going to go too into that. So that's the thinking. We'll see what happens in practice. He's got 5 years to give it a go. But so I'll move it on to the second part of the political stuff, because it's slightly relevant. There's a bit of a segue from what you were saying about pending decisions. Another pending decision we have to make is over 5G security and which vendors we're going to allow to participate in it. Now, we touched on it a little bit earlier, and I put it off because I knew we were going to come to it. So Norway, in principle, said, Huawei's fine, but then it's turned out that Ericsson's beat them for whatever reason, dropping their pants or being better or whatever. Germany said, we haven't got a problem with them. France said they haven't got a problem. In fact, I think Merkel, even the German Prime Minister, said a speech recently saying there needs to be a pan-European position on it, and it should be Germany and France that decides it. Which I thought, for a Eurosceptic like me, it was just fodder. It was like, there you go. Yeah. They want to.
They've also had some position papers on it, haven't they? The EU recently, like October, they came out with their sort of 5G security, position paper, and nothing's been set down in stone yet, obviously. But
no, and I think that's fair enough, and that's where this is for me, a political decision, and I'm quite happy for you to sort of nuance this position, but I'm going to make quite an absolute position. I think it's a political decision because no one's presented any hard evidence that Huawei poses a security threat. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that I don't think they might be, because I certainly think the Chinese government, is a bit opaque, can be a bit Machiavellian. We've got this chap, Xi Jinping, now, who's voted himself leader forever, which, is a bit jarring as someone who's just basking in an electoral victory. And they've obviously been, for a few decades, felt very competitive towards the rest of the world and wanting to be a bigger player, which is fine, they're allowed to be. But I think there is some proof, not necessarily with Huawei itself, but with China as a country, that they've sometimes cheated. Yeah. So,
well, that's the bigger issue for me, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that this whole security discussion, I find it hard to have a strong view on it anyway, because, on the one hand, I feel myself, as someone who lives in a Western democracy and I uphold those values, then I can sort of see, if we did have some kind of big conflict in the future, we're probably going to be on the opposite side to China, and therefore having a kind of having.
They're the new opposing superpower to the US
exactly.
and the West,
you wouldn't have bought telecom equipment off Nazi Germany, would you? So if it was available then. So,
not that we're comparing China to Nazi Germany.
No, but it's a totalitarian system, and it's.
Well, and you wouldn't have bought in the Cold War. You wouldn't have bought telecoms equipment off Russia.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but on the other hand, I just don't know how robust the argument is, because there's. We've seen snooping happening before through the Russians and the Chinese,
and
where equipment's not involved.
Everyone's spying on each other.
There's lots of companies that provide smartphones that come or IT gear that come out of Asia that aren't subject to the same kind of scrutiny. There's Western companies that make stuff in China, a lot of stuff in China, where you could easily have stuff introduced in the supply chain without them even knowing about it.
Yeah, well,
like
Apple and Foxconn and all that.
Yeah,
sort of
but also the big rivals to Huawei have big Chinese manufacturing facilities, and
because it's been known for decades that the cost of labour is far lower there than it is in the West.
Exactly. So I find the whole that debate's a bit, for me, it's hard to sort of have a firm view one way or the other. But the thing I think is more of a reason to be concerned about Huawei is just unfair trade practices. I think there's a lot of sort of evidence that they've not competed fairly.
Huawei specifically.
Yeah. I mean, I can't. That's the big
historically.
Historically, yeah. And the Chinese system itself is clearly rigged against Western companies. You can't. Any other market you have a tender and then companies get chosen, and Huawei was able to come in and be very competitive in Europe and is now the biggest provider of mobile infrastructure. Ericsson and Nokia can't go into China and expect to have more than a 20-30% market share. I'm not sure what it is, but Ericsson's got about 10%.
There's a sort of cap. It's artificially limited.
It's artificially limited what they can get. There's always I can't name names people that have spoken to who I know this, but there are sources that say they're guaranteed 60%. The two big Huawei and ZTE, the two big Chinese guys, are guaranteed 60%. You've got Nokia with its sort of joint venture called Nokia Shanghai Bell that gets some work, and then you've got Nokia standalone and Ericsson that pick up some business, but they're never going to get more than a certain
so that's not
level.
an open
and
market.
It's not an open market. And then just things like that all these allegations against Huawei at the moment for intellectual property theft, that relate to this sort of US case against the chief financial officer who's still she's still being detained in Canada. She's wanted for extradition, but there's a whole string of charges there. It's not
wasn't
just
that specific one to do with sanction
busting?
Well,
her specific one was to do with lying to financiers about us. But they're also wanted for sort of intellectual property violations. They're accused of flaunting WTO rules. This looks very similar to sort of Airbus Boeing dispute that's happened between the US and European Union. This selling stuff below the cost of production to try and build market share, which is against WTO rules. And, Ericsson and Nokia, so we hear, aren't allowed to do things like that. I mean, the caveat here, of course, is, having said all that, there have been some fairly shocking stories in the last couple of weeks about some of the things that Ericsson's been up to over the years.
So they finally, for people listening who don't know the context, they finally resolved the investigation which was going on for about 3 years in the States about them basically, I think the official thing is a Foreign Corrupt something or other Act. Yeah,
Practices Act.
But basically giving backhanders in a few countries, mainly developing countries, aren't they?
Well, China was one of them.
Oh, China's one of them.
So bribing service providers in China, essentially, to win contracts.
Yeah, and they got fined about $1 billion for that, didn't they? I personally, I don't know if you read my take on it, but I just thought while I was writing, hold on. None of this happened in the States. Yeah. It's happened in China and Egypt and Djibouti and God knows.
Djibouti was one of the main ones,
why are the Yanks even getting involved? And why do the Yanks get to trouser $1 billion?
Yeah.
I mean, is any of that money going either back to the countries where the supposed corruption happened?
That's a very good question.
And B, going into the hands of any of the other companies that are supposedly harmed by this corruption?
That's a really good point, yeah.
It's just going to the US Exchequer, or whatever they call it.
Yeah, that's
Federal
a really,
Reserve
really good
Bank.
point, yeah.
So that's funny, and everyone just sort of accepts it. So it's funny, that's another weird manifestation of the US as a world's policeman. And, we can't mean too much. We're perfectly happy for them to be the world's policeman when they're sending their lads into the Middle East or whatever, however misguided that might have been in hindsight. But, when something needs sorting out geopolitically, we're quite happy to leave it to the Americans.
Yeah.
But it does seem a bit weird for them to be the world's antitrust or corruption policeman as well.
It does, yeah. I guess because, I suppose, based on the fact that Ericsson has a presence and dealings in the US, I mean, maybe that's why it's... I don't know. I don't know what the...
I'm sure they think they've got a good reason. I'm sure I don't know the half of it.
Similar things, apparently, there's still a risk that similar things happen in other jurisdictions. So there's still a possibility that China, for instance, or Djibouti would launch their own investigations into what's gone on. Now, maybe it's less likely because some of the people that were bribed were high-ranking government officials, apparently. So maybe they're not going to press an investigation because it's something they might be involved in.
That's the other point I made. Maybe I was a bit too cynical in my story. The other point I made is, I presume this happens everywhere. I've had when I was younger, my dad used to live in like developing countries, and it's quite obvious that corruption was endemic, and everyone's just greasing each other's palms, and that's just how it works.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I approve of it, but it's just endemic.
Yeah.
So it seems the only thing Ericsson did wrong was get caught.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, the thing that I do remember reading the details of the DOJ statement went into quite a lot of detail, I think, about the exact sums of money. And I was quite shocked by it, I have to say, that it was so, because I know it was only mainly smaller markets, but it was quite widespread. It was China, Djibouti, Saudi Arabia, places that are all over the place. Indonesia was another one. And it's very similar sort of detail, very similar things happening. And also, I noticed this all, I mean, there's a Saturday morning call which I ended up joining with Echo, and he got asked about his own responsibility
you're more
for it.
conscientious than I am.
Now he only took over as CEO in 2017, which is basically after all this happened. But he was on the board for 10 years. He was on the Ericsson board, and he got asked, "Well, hang on a minute, did the board fail to? How did the board not notice this was going on? Because it's quite big sums of money that were changing hands in some cases, and big contracts they were winning. So were they not saying, how are we winning this contract so easily? Was it not ringing any bells?
No, I think definitely there was a real lack of oversight, and I would imagine, I don't know, this is just speculation, but companies tend to be, we work ultimately for a PLC ourselves, and I've seen it from the inside. They tend to be very driven by targets, by monthly, quarterly, annual targets, sales revenue targets, typically even more than profit. And maybe senior managers get their bonuses on the basis of margin, but most people are incentivized to just bring in cash. And this is where this kind of like more Western style corruption tends to happen. Is people I remember this happened with Acer PCs in the UK a little while back when I was writing about that. Everyone was just under such aggressive targets that they would just do anything. And that's where the lack of oversight. You can imagine the senior commercial people going, "Look, I don't want to know how, just bring your numbers in."
Yeah.
And that tends to be how these things happen. And as you say, then it goes all the way up. It goes all the way up to Vestberg, who was in charge for a lot of the time.
He left in 2016, and he was CEO for quite a long time. So this
it'd be funny if Verizon gets done. I'm not saying they will, but I'm not saying he knew.
It might be interesting to see some of the names that come out of this, because it was apparently some high-ranking Ericsson people were involved. Now, they're not so high-ranking that we've heard someone left, because we'd have noticed it by now. But there were. None of the names have emerged, as far as I'm aware. 49 executives have left to do with it, and I think it'd be interesting to see if any of the names do emerge. But
so to bring it back, I think we've got to wrap it up soon, because we've got to go off and do.
We've gone on all sorts of tangents.
Yeah, well, it's good.
Today,
it's good fun. This is more like a classic sort of Joe Rogan, just meandering, whatever type of thing, isn't it?
Beer involved.
Yeah, exactly. If it was Joe Rogan, he would have sparked a massive spliff by now. But so where that's relevant to the sort of second string of the political topic is Huawei's getting accused of a bunch of stuff, some of which there's some evidence for, some of which people have yet to show definitive evidence of, i.e. the security threat. And I think they're right to test American due process and take it to the courts in the States, because they're like, okay, you're so into due process and doing things properly, right? We'll do this properly as well, which I think is perfectly reasonable for them to do. Obviously, if the Yanks finally do come up with some proper evidence, that'll blow back in their face. But they're basically betting they haven't got any. Anyway, but the point is, even if they have done everything, no one's squeaky clean, as that Ericsson thing points out. And
it's, ZTE has already had its run in and agreed to pay fines. Similar thing to what happened with Ericsson in a way. I mean, I know it's specifically about deals in Iran and North Korea, but it was a DOJ investigation that led to big bribes. The other one is Nokia, which flagged in March that it uncovered some compliance issues with an Alcatel-Lucent, and that there could be criminal charges related to that. There's not been anything since then, which has been quite a long time, but that's one to watch early next year. But if they end up getting caught up in some similar thing, then it's interesting, because Ericsson was talking about reputational damage, the risk that companies don't use them. Where it's like, well, who are you going to turn to instead? If they're all doing the same thing. So maybe to sort of wrap that up, because the competition side of it's interesting. So we've basically got three main sort of kit vendors, and it would be a topic for another
podcast to talk about whether or not that's still going to be a case next year or in a few years' time, because the market could fragment into more specialists.
It's like talking about tennis, isn't it? Can anyone crack the top three?
Right, exactly. So if we've got, which is Huawei then, Roger Federer?
Well, Huawei must be Roger Federer.
Okay.
I reckon Nokia's Djokovic and Ericsson's Rafael Nadal.
Okay, fair enough. But that's still only three, and then you rule one out, as the Americans are doing with Huawei, then you've only got two. And that's not a very competitive situation. And I'm not saying that Ericsson and Nokia would behave in an overtly cartellish sort of way, but, you know, they're disincentivized to compete too hard with each other on price when there isn't at least a third one, keeping on honest. So there's that there. And I think, I mean, to draw a line on the political side of things, it comes down to this standoff between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. So it looks likely that Trump's going to be re-elected, if only because the opposing party are just doing such a bad job.
It's like Corbyn.
Of opposing him, yeah. So he's going to be there for another sort of 4 or 5 years, doing his Trump thing. You know, I was writing. There was a rumor, a story today in the Wall Street Journal about how maybe the US and China are striking some kind of initial deal.
Right.
And part of the deal was that, you know, from the US side, they'd row back on some tariffs and sanctions and stuff. I know the building keeps vibrating, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was
We're
weird.
having an earthquake. Yes. If so, it's nice knowing you.
We've lost Pierre in this podcast.
Yeah, it's all right. Well,
he joined in at first, but then he got fed up with it.
I'm listening. It's
He's waiting
here.
for us to finish.
It's putting me to sleep.
Well, we got to wrap up anyway. And then China was going to buy more US agricultural stuff.
Yeah.
So it's very transactional, and that's how Trump works. And I very loosely gather that business tends to be a bit more overtly transactional in the Far East compared to what we're used to anyway. But then I realised that actually China's retaliation for all this stuff has been to stop buying agricultural stuff. So all they're really going to do is restore it to something like how it was a year or two ago.
Yeah.
And the same goes for reversing the sanctions and the tariffs. So there's a bit of a stalemate there. But the interesting thing about it is whether or not this pushes things onto what the Wall Street Journal article describes as a second phase, where they start talking about things like not playing fair, like currency manipulation, IP theft, and presumably the Huawei situation would come up in that.
Yeah.
Because my view has always been, and I'll say this as a final thing because we've got to wrap it up, that Huawei's mainly been a pawn in this bigger game between the US and China. That's not to say Huawei's completely spotless and not historically has maybe, you know, got hold of some IP that it shouldn't have got hold of. But right now, as it is now, I think it's mainly a pawn. And I think maybe in 2020, we'll see that come to a head one way or the other. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's a pawn in the trade dispute. Yeah, I think, I think it's caught up in that whole issue, and it's very hard to see how it plays out because there's so many things that happen that are hard to predict, and sometimes earlier this year it almost seemed like some deal could be done and that they rode back a lot of the stuff they were doing to kind of clamp down on Huawei, and in the last few weeks it's almost like they've gone after them more aggressively again and are trying to sort of lean on European allies. It's very up and down. It's very
and
hard
maybe
to
nothing will happen
figure
next
out.
year because Trump would be trying to get re-elected.
Well, it could just be more of the same, really.
Yeah,
and it just
probably
rumbles on, and we end up in the same position doing this podcast, drinking whiskey next year, talking about the same stuff. Probably
on that note, it's nearly 3:30. We've got to go off and do Secret Santa with our colleagues. So if we don't do another one this year, thank you very much for listening this year. Well, I think Pierre tells me we've got a nice lot of people in terms of traffic we picked up this year. So thanks to everyone. And have a good New Year, Christmas and New Year, and we'll see you then. Cheers. Bye.